I've got some vintage suitcases on top of my on top of my closet, and I'm gonna try to change the look and put the vintage bike up there.
His boss away from the plane. The officer explained that they were supposed to be taking an overseas business trip. Canceled, an agent said, presenting his creds. Hooper and Raymond handed Jim over to several of the key Squad NS-34 investigators behind the
Come ti chiami?
Matteo.
E vai in bici tu?
Sì.
È una bici da corsa o mountain bike?
Mountain bike.
E tu vai forte in bici?
Un pochino, sì.
Senti, tu sai qualcosa in inglese?
No.
Niente? Niente.
No.
Va bene, ok.
Alcune parti del corpo,
Tipo?
tipo mouth,
Sì?
nose,
Sì? Bravo.
leg,
Sì?
poi non mi ricordo proprio benissimo.
Benissimo, vai. Lo spengo qua, grazie.
Prego.
Buonasera.
Perfect.
Hi David, your frame's ready.
This is my 1968 Colnago that they refinished for me, and you can see it's gorgeous. They put the decals on under the transparent, and they painted these little black spots for me, and it's just perfect. Actually, they told me that the frame wasn't straight, and they had to put it in I don't know what you call it.
Yes, it's true.
A device that measures the frame so they could bend it back to shape. Anyway, it's gorgeous. It's really pretty. I think this bike is a 1967 or 68 Colnago, although to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. So I'll tell you first why I think this is a Colnago, and then I'll tell you why I think it might not be a Colnago. I believe it's a Colnago because it has this bottom bracket with this drilling pattern. I also think it's a Colnago because of the fork crown. The things that perplex me a bit are these lugs. I haven't found other lugs like this online. I've never seen one that has a peg for the pump. The color, I believe, is the original color. When I bought the bike, it had been repainted, and there was just a little bit of paint left on the steerer tube inside the frame. And based on that little bit of color on the steerer tube, I used that color to paint the whole bike. The older Campagnolo wheels, I think from like 1969 and back, just say Campagnolo. They don't say Campagnolo with record written below in capital letters. You can find these online, but they usually cost a fortune. I was able to find a pair that are a bit run down, but they have the correct hub. You can actually take off the lock nut on these old Campagnolo bikes, and I'm not going to do it now, but on the back of the lock nut is a date stamp, and these particular wheels are from 1961. I ended up taking apart the rear hub anyway, and you can see the date stamp there. It says CAM, and then below it says 61, and this was built in 1961 in Vicenza, Italy, in the north of Italy. I think it is so cool. Of course, these wheels have the straight, the skewer with the straight lever on it. later in the early 1970s that was switched to a curved lever. The bike came with a 6-speed Japanese freewheel, which I didn't like. I wanted something that was period correct, and I found this online. This is a 5-speed Regina made in Italy freewheel, and I counted the teeth. The smallest one is a 14 and the biggest cog is a 22. I can't imagine heading out today and trying to ride around with a 1422 5-speed in the back. These older steel frames have these rear adjusting screws in the rear dropouts, and there's actually 2 lengths. There's a newer length, which is the shorter one you see there, and the older bikes have these longer screws. I didn't think I was going to be able to find the older screws, and somehow a guy in Poland had them, and they're actually brand new. They call new old stock, and I ordered a couple, and I am amazed that he had those. I can't understand how it's possible he has new old stock adjusting screws, but I'm thrilled to have them. The seat the bike came with also wasn't period correct, and so I searched and searched. Cinelli made these seats, these Unicanator, years ago, and they're hard to find in good condition. They're particularly hard to find with writing intact on the sides, because obviously your leg rubs against it and takes it off. I think this seat hasn't been used, although I don't know if you can see or not, the sides are scuffed right here, as if the bike was leaned up against a wall many times. And I actually took the seat to a guy who repairs shoes and polishes shoes, and asked if he could polish that out, and he said no. I thought he was going to say, what are you talking about? It's a bike seat. But he actually said no. He said you can't polish it out. But anyway, I think it looks great. It'll be fine. I'm really pleased with it. I wanted to get a period correct crankset, and the one that came with the bike wasn't period correct. I can't remember exactly how this works, but there's some information on the back of the crank, and I believe the ones that don't have the date stamp, there's like a circle or a diamond with a 2-digit date stamp on some of these cranks. The ones without that are the older ones. This water bottle cage came with a bike, and it's very heavy and it's steel, but I think it looks just great. I suspect it's original to the bike. I particularly like these little plastic wheels on the top to help the bottle roll in. The bike came with what I think were its original pedals, but they were these cheap pedals. I forget the brand. I think it might be Sheffield. And I just didn't like the way they looked, so I found these period correct Campanile pedals, and I think they're period correct because they have this little tab, I don't know if you can see, for that the toe strap passes through. These are kind of beat up. I never like to spend too much on these old bikes. I want to get period parts, but I don't want to go crazy buying pristine stuff sometimes. And pedals tend to be quite expensive. These, the finish is terrible, but they seem perfectly functional. I also bought these toe clips and straps on eBay, and I didn't want to buy something that seemed very modern. I don't actually know when these were made, but they say made in Italy, and I suspect they're from the 1960s. I think they look fine, except for the finish. I think these pedals are great. I think the derailleur is original to the bike. The Campagnolo rear derailleurs often can be dated by looking at the date stamp on top. It'll say 79, 80, that refers to the year it was made. The older ones just say patent, like this one, and they don't have the date stamp. So I think this is the original derailleur from the late 1960s. And it's in surprisingly good condition, given that it's 50 years old. I don't know if you can see this or not. How beautiful is that? There's just something about this old stuff that I find just gorgeous. I think it's just incredible the way the stuff was made and how stylish it was. It's truly a time gone by, but it's just so beautiful. How can a simple front derailleur be so beautiful? It's a testament to a different time in Italy when things were made by hand, and Italy was at the top of its game for so many manufactured items. The bike came with a different set of brakes. It had the Universal 68 brakes. I read online that they're called Universal 68 because they came out in 1968. And I used them once on an 80 kilometer ride in the rain, and they were horrible, just terrible, uncomfortable, bad stopping power, no modulation, just awful. I think it might have had something to do with the 50-year-old brake pads I was using, but I don't know. And ever since then, I haven't wanted to use those brakes. Plus, I think they're really ugly. And so on this bike, I went online and I found a vintage set of Campagnolo brakes. And if you get really super attentive to details, the earlier generation brake levers had a circular hole in the bottom, and the later ones had a larger cutout, which is like more of a long oval. So I went to the extra effort to search out some correct brake levers, and surprisingly, they're not scratched. Often, actually, I take that back, they're a little scratched. Often they get really scratched up because people lean the bikes up against stuff. But anyway, I think they're beautiful. One of my pet peeves about the handlebar tape is that often they give you just enough to barely do the handlebar. Why? I would gladly pay whatever it costs, $5 more bucks, to have another foot of handlebar tape, and I could just use as much as I want. I had to retape one side of the bar like 4 times to get it to work. It's ridiculous. After a full day of mounting vintage parts, the bike is done. I think it looks spectacular. There's only a couple components that are kind of rough. As I showed you earlier, the pedals are kind of rough, and the hubs are kind of rough, but that's fine. The rest that's not rough, I think, is so gorgeous. I think the brakes, the chromed top of the fork, these new decals. Somehow the seat post didn't get scratched, which I think is a minor miracle. The seat looks great. I had a really tough time getting the clamp for the front shifters to catch the nut. It was just really, really short. I think it's because the frame is actually a bit bigger at that point due to a thicker paint job and the transparent coat he puts on. Although I had no problem with the front derailleur, which has the exact same length bolt and the same nut. I also had to get the rubber mallet out and hammer the rear brake through the opening in the frame for the rear brake because there was a little bit of paint in there. I also had trouble mounting the rear derailleur. I think he didn't chase the threads, and there was some paint in there, and it was hard to get the thread started on the rear derailleur, although I just fiddled with it, and eventually it started. These new longer screws, I think, look awesome, and they're the perfect screws for this frame. When I gave the frame to the painter, one of the screws was rusted in. I couldn't get it out, and I don't know how he got it out, but he got it out, and it's just perfect. I asked him to paint these circles black. There are these little circles on the lugs and on the crown of the fork, and I think they look great. I also paid to have the fork crown re-chromed, which I'm glad I did. It was quite corroded and looks much better like that. The quality of decals is also very good. In fact, the painter asked me where I got these decals. There's a number of people on the internet selling decals, and some are better than others. I think for me it's a question of how pixelated they are, and these seem very, very precise and not very pixelated. The painter also told me they're quite thin, so it was easy to get the clear coat over the top of them. I think, for the most part, the bike is period correct, a word I was using before. I think everything on here is from 1967 or earlier, except of course like the handlebar tape and the reproduction hoods. But overall, I think it's just gorgeous. It's not my size, and who knows if I'll ever ride it. When I bought it, I told myself I was going to sell it, and now that I see it, I'll have a hard time selling it. But it was a fun 2.5-year project that's now come to the end. These things are goofy that I enjoy chasing the parts and taking the things apart and reassembling and cleaning it. Once it's done, the fun is kind of over. I store them someplace, and I rarely get a chance to even look at them. I don't know about that. I think the vintage luggage is going to end up returning to the top of the closet. But we'll see. I'll try it for a few days.